I gifted my daughter this beach house as a 12th wedding anniversary present. That day, I drove over to visit, but I stopped short when I saw a stranger standing in front of the door, holding a clipboard, casually taking pictures of the entire house. Then I looked through the window and caught my son-in-law hiding behind the thin living room curtains, standing perfectly still and staring right at me instead of coming out to greet me. A cold chill ran down my spine. I knew, right then, that something was wrong. Some mornings, I still make the drive out to Harlow Beach before the sun has fully risen. I sit on this porch like it belongs to me. Because in every way that actually matters, it does. The drive is 25 minutes from my place, door to door, if the light on Carpenter Road cooperates. I have made it so many times by now that my truck knows the turns before I do. Usually, it is Saturday mornings, sometimes Sunday, occasionally a Wednesday, when something I cannot quite name pulls me out here in the middle of the week, and I find myself watching the Atlantic go gray and then gold from a chair I built with my own 2 hands. I should tell you a few things about myself before I go any further. My name is Warren. I am 68 years old. I spent 40 years as a structural engineer, the kind of man who looks at a building and sees the bones of it, the load-bearing walls, the places where pressure collects over time. I retired 4 years ago, but that way of seeing things never really leaves you. You spend 4 decades reading blueprints, and after a while you start reading everything else the same way, people included. I live alone. I have for 8 years now, ever since June passed. My house is a modest place on the edge of Calverton, the town just inland from here, with a yellow front door that June picked out one Saturday afternoon because she said it made the whole street look like it was in a better mood. I never changed it. I do not plan to, but this house, the one I am sitting in front of right now, is different. It is a single-story place, built low and wide, the way beach houses should be, so the wind does not get ideas. Heart pine floors throughout, the kind that darken to amber over time and hold the warmth of the sun long after it sets. Wide doorways, no steps up from the front walk, and that part was deliberate, because my daughter Nora had a bad fall off her bicycle back in 2018. Left knee, 2 surgeries. I was not going to build her a house that fought her every time she came home. The windows face the water. All of them. I spent 2 weeks arguing with myself about the structural implications and then did it anyway, because some things matter more than load calculations. I finished this house 14 months ago, in March of last year. I built it for Nora. I finished it in the year she and Brett marked 12 years of marriage. Though the house was never really about Brett. And it was never really about the marriage. It was about Nora, and about Gracie, who is 8 years old and has her grandmother's laugh, loud and sudden and completely unself-conscious. The kind of laugh that makes strangers in restaurants turn around and smile. I did not build it for myself. That distinction matters. Really, it is the whole point of this story. When I step through the front door, I usually leave it unlocked on mornings when I come early, and I pick up the small, framed photograph from the side table. Just inside, June, maybe 10 years before she got sick, standing on a beach that is not this one. Her hair is doing what it always did in salt air, which is whatever it wanted. She is laughing at something off camera. She looks like herself. I put this photo here when the house was finished. Not at my place in Calverton. Here. People who know me have asked about that. My buddy Sal from the old firm, my neighbor Ted, both of them have asked why I did not keep it at home. I have never had a clean answer. The best I can say is this. My house in Calverton is where I live. This house is where the promise is. And June was the one who made me make that promise. It felt right to put her here. That is where this story ends. On this porch, in this particular slant of April light across the water. But to understand why I am sitting here, and why any of this matters, I have to take you back to the beginning, to a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, to a woman's hand in mine, to a promise I made before I fully understood what keeping it would cost. 8 years ago, I stood in a hospital corridor that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, and I made a promise I did not fully understand yet. That is the honest way to say it. I did not understand it. I thought I did. I nodded. I said the words. I meant them the way a man means things when he is standing at the edge of losing everything. But the full weight of what I had agreed to did not settle on me until much later, until I was alone in my kitchen at 2 in the morning with a sleeping infant and a house that had gone completely, permanently quiet. March of 2017. Mercy General, 3rd floor. The hallway outside room 314. The fluorescent light above the nurse's station buzzed with a sound like a trapped insect. I remember that sound. Strange, what stays with you when your life is changing, not because it matters, but because it was there. June had been sick for 14 months by then. Breast cancer, caught late, fought hard. She was 49 years old, and she fought it the way she did everything else, methodically, without self-pity, and with an occasional dark humor that unnerved her oncologist and made the nurses adore her. She made it longer than they told us she would. That was very June. I will not describe what she looked like at the end. That is not mine to put into words. What I will tell you is this. Her hands were still hers even then. Long fingers, the knuckle of her left ring finger slightly enlarged from the arthritis that had started in her 40s. I held that hand for most of the last 2 days. I know every line of it. She spoke to me just before midnight on a Tuesday. Her voice was low, lower than it used to be, and she had to stop twice to catch her breath. But her eyes were clear. That is the thing I want you to understand. Her eyes were completely clear. "Take care of our girls, Warren," she said. "Both of them. Nora still needs her father, even if she does not always know how to say it. And this little one," she paused and turned her head toward the small bassinet the nurse had wheeled in so June could see her. "Gracie, 4-year-old, born into a family that was expanding and breaking apart at the exact same time. This little one is going to need to know what real love looks like," June said. "Make sure she sees it." I told her I would. She died 6 hours later, at 5:47 in the morning, while the sky outside was doing that thing it does in early spring, turning from black to a dark, uncertain blue, not quite committing to dawn. I drove home alone. Nora was still at the hospital. Her husband Brett had come to get her, and one of her friends was staying with her too. I offered to stay, but Nora shook her head in the way she does when she needs to fall apart privately. She got that from June. I had offered to keep Gracie for the night. Nora had not slept in 2 days, and the baby was calm. Sometimes the most useful thing a father can do is carry something heavy so his kid does not have to. So I had Gracie in the infant seat in the back of my truck, asleep before we hit the highway. Small fists curled near her face like she was ready for a fight she did not know was coming. My house in Calverton was dark when I got there. I had not left any lights on because I had not planned on coming home that night. I stood in the doorway for a moment, Gracie's carrier in one hand, and I looked at what 8 years of living with someone looks like when that someone is suddenly gone. It looks like a pair of reading glasses on the end table. It looks like a cardigan draped over the back of the couch because she was always cold. It looks like 2 coffee mugs in the dish rack because she had washed them both that last morning before the hospital called to say she had taken a turn. Her slippers were by the door, the kind with the memory foam insoles she had ordered online and loved unreasonably. I stepped around them. I could not bring myself to move them. I sat down in the chair by the window with Gracie against my chest. 4 days old, breathing in that quick, shallow way newborns do, like they are still surprised by the whole concept of air. Outside, the street was empty. The yellow door of my house caught the last of the nightlight and glowed faintly. And I thought about June picking that color on a Saturday afternoon because she said it made the whole street look like it was in a better mood. Take care of our girls. I looked down at this tiny person on my chest. This child who had never met her grandmother and would never remember the sound of June's laugh or the way she smelled like cedar and hand lotion. Then I thought about Nora, 30 minutes away in a hospital room that still held the shape of her mother. I was 60 years old. I lived alone. I was a structural engineer who understood load-bearing walls and tensile strength and what happens to a building when pressure is applied in the wrong place for too long. I had no idea how to do what June had asked me to do, but I had said I would. That night, sitting in the dark with Gracie asleep on my chest and June's slippers still by the door, I decided that not knowing how was not the same as not doing it. I would figure it out. Nora had her mother's eyes, and for a long time I thought that was enough to keep everything together. I should tell you about Brett before I tell you about the house, because you cannot understand one without understanding the other. Brett Allen Calloway, 43 years old. When Nora first brought him to my place in Calverton, it was the spring of 2012. about 4 months before the wedding. He was 31, and he had the kind of confidence that reads as competence until you know a man long enough to tell the difference. He shook my hand at the door. Firm grip, eye contact, the whole package. He complimented the house. "Great bones on this place, Warren," he said. Coming from a real estate agent, it landed somewhere between professional observation and a line he had used before. I showed him around anyway. He asked smart questions about the foundation, the age of the roof, the HVAC system. He knew his stuff. I will give him that. At the time, Brett was doing well. Better than well, actually. He had built a solid book of business in residential sales up and down the coast. Mid-range properties mostly, a few luxury listings. The kind of career that looks like a straight line going up when you are in your early 30s and the market is cooperating. He closed somewhere between 30 and 40 transactions a year. He drove a clean car and wore clothes that fit. He talked about the future the way people do when they genuinely believe it belongs to them. What happened later was not a mystery once you understood how the market shifted. Around 2015 and 2016, the whole industry started changing underneath men like Brett. Online platforms began doing what brokers used to do. Buyers stopped needing a middleman just to find listings. Commissions shrank. Volume dried up. Some agents adapted, went high-end, went commercial, rebuilt their whole approach. Brett did not. He kept doing what he had always done, just with fewer clients and worse margins. And by 2019, the gap between his lifestyle and his income had become a problem he was solving with other people's money. But back in 2012, none of that had happened yet. At the wedding that August, outdoor ceremony, vineyard about an hour inland, the kind of venue that costs more than it looks. I stood near the back and watched Brett wait for Nora at the end of the aisle. He looked at her when she came through the gate in her dress, and I studied his face the way I study blueprints, looking for where the load settles. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is proud to own. Now I want to be careful here. Because I could be wrong. I have turned that image over in my mind enough times that I am not entirely sure anymore what I saw and what I have since projected onto it. Maybe it was just a man who loved his bride and showed it in a way that read differently to the father watching from 20 feet away. That is possible. I do not want to be unfair. But I noticed it. I filed it away, and I said nothing, because Nora was happy, and because a father's job at his daughter's wedding is to hold it together and mean it when he says the toast. The years that followed settled into a rhythm. Holidays at my place in Calverton. Thanksgiving. Christmas. The occasional birthday. June's cooking at first. Then after 2017, mine and Nora's combined efforts, which were competent but never the same. Brett was present through all of it. Sociable enough. He could hold a conversation, remembered what you said the last time, brought decent wine. He was the kind of person who is easy to be around without ever becoming easy to know. Gracie came along in late 2016, born about 4 months before June passed, which meant June got to hold her twice before the end. I am grateful every day for those 2 times. Having a grandchild in the house changed the texture of those family gatherings. Gracie was the kind of kid who filled a room without trying, the way her grandmother had. In 2019, Brett called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Not a Sunday dinner kind of call. A Tuesday. He needed $25,000. Short-term cash flow problem, he said. A deal had fallen through. Another one was pending. The timing was just off. He would pay me back in 90 days. He was relaxed about it. The way he was relaxed about most things. Like the outcome was already decided and he was just filling me in. I knew better. 40 years of reading blueprints had taught me to check every line before I signed anything. A loan with no paperwork is just a gift with extra steps. I knew that. I had told clients that. I had watched people lose real money over handshake agreements that everyone remembered differently 6 months later. But Nora was happy. Or seemed to be. And there was something in the way Brett asked. Easy, unbothered, family to family. That made pressing for documentation feel like an accusation I was not ready to make. So I wired the money and said nothing about contracts. That was my mistake. I knew it when I was making it. I made it anyway. He never paid it back. Not in 90 days. Not in 90 weeks. We never discussed it again. And I never brought it up, because by then other things had started to matter more. The idea for the house did not arrive all at once. It grew the way most important decisions do, slowly, then all at once. It started sometime in 2021, about 4 years after June died, during a Tuesday afternoon when I was sitting at my drafting table going over load calculations for a commercial project I did not particularly care about. I put down my pencil and thought about Nora, about the apartment she and Brett were renting, about the way Gracie had asked me at Christmas whether Santa knew which house they lived in because they had moved twice that year. I thought about the fact that June had asked me to take care of our girls, and I had spent 4 years mostly just showing up at holidays and calling on Sundays and telling myself that was enough. It was not enough. I knew that. So I opened a new file on my drafting software and started drawing. What followed was 3 years of quiet, deliberate accumulation. I skipped the fishing trip to Montana I had been planning since 2019. I picked up 2 smaller consulting projects on the side, one for a church renovation in Calverton, one for a private developer who needed a second opinion on a foundation issue. I stopped going out for dinner on Fridays and started cooking instead. I refinanced the Calverton house at a lower rate and redirected the difference. None of it was dramatic. It was the same arithmetic I had been doing my whole career, just pointed at something that mattered. By the spring of 2023, I had enough. The design had been evolving the whole time. Because that is how I work. I do not believe in rushing the drawing phase. Get the blueprints wrong, and everything that follows is just expensive correction. So I drew and revised and drew again, and every version was a little bit about engineering, and a lot about Nora. Single story, because of the bicycle accident in 2018. Left knee. 2 surgeries. No steps up from the front walk. Wide doorways, 36 inches instead of the standard 32, because someday arthritis or a bad day might make those 4 inches matter. Heart pine floors throughout, because they are warm in winter and they hold up. Big windows facing the water, because Nora has always thought better when she can see the horizon. Every choice had a reason. That is the only way I know how to build. I found the lot at Harlow Beach through a retired contractor I had worked with on and off over the years. Waterfront parcel, modest size, decent elevation. Above storm surge, important on the Carolina coast, where the Atlantic has opinions. The lot had been sitting for a while, which kept the price reasonable. I broke ground in the fall of 2023. That is when I met Audrey. She came over about a week into the foundation work, walking across the adjoining property with 2 mugs of coffee and a look on her face like she had decided to come say hello, and was not entirely sure it was a good idea. Her name was Audrey Dalton, 66 years old, recently retired, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people had to pay attention when she spoke. She had been a circuit court judge for 22 years. Family court, then civil, then a rotation through criminal before her knees made the commute untenable, and she retired to the beach house she and her late husband had bought years earlier as a vacation property and never quite gotten around to selling. She lived alone and had for 3 years since her husband Martin passed. She told me this matter-of-factly, the way people do when they have made peace with a fact and no longer need sympathy for it. "What are you building?" she asked, handing me one of the mugs without asking whether I wanted it. "A house," I said. "For my daughter." She looked at the lot, at the foundation stakes, at the water beyond them. Then she nodded once, and did not ask anything else. We drank the coffee. She went back to her place. The next morning she came back with 2 more mugs. That became the pattern. Over those months, I learned that Audrey had spent a significant part of her judicial career in civil court handling property disputes, fraud cases, forged deeds, contested estates, the kind of cases where someone had trusted the wrong person with something that could not be taken back. She had seen enough of that kind of damage to develop a finely calibrated instinct for it. I did not know then how relevant that would become. My parents called in November, about a month into the framing. My father, Eugene, is 91 years old and lives at Pineview, a care facility about 40 minutes from Calverton that he describes as not as bad as I expected, which is about the most you can ask for at his age. My mother, Miriam, is 88 and thinks the staff waters down the soup. They called together, which means speakerphone. Volume turned up high enough that I can hear both of them even when only one is talking. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" my father asked. "It is already built in my head, Dad," I said. "I am in the framing stage." I mean financially. I told him I had run the numbers. There was a pause. Your mother wants to know if Nora knows. She knows I am building something. She thinks it might be a workshop. She does not know the details. Another pause. Longer. That sounds like you, my mother said from somewhere near the phone. She was not wrong. The house was finished in March of 2024. Norby Annagest, Nora and Brett's 12th wedding anniversary was in August. I had been aware of that date for 2 years while I was building. Not because I planned the house as an anniversary gift in the conventional sense, but because it gave me a frame, a reason to finish by summer that was easier to explain than the real one. I finished early, which was not a surprise. I have always preferred to be ready before I am needed. Before I handed Nora the keys, I sat down with a property attorney in Harlow Beach and transferred the deed. The title was put in Nora's name, clearly and cleanly, with my name retained as a secondary interest during my lifetime. I had seen too many families, professionally and personally, watch property slip away because the paperwork was not right. A deed does not protect against everything. But it was the obvious first step, and I took it. I thought about setting up a revocable living trust at the same time. A trust would have added another layer, made it harder for anyone to encumber or transfer the property without proper authorization. But the attorney said the deed structure was solid, and I did not have any specific reason for concern. So I filed it away as something to revisit later. I had no particular urgency. That was a gap I would come to understand much later. The day of the walkthrough, Nora stood at the front door for a long moment before she went inside. I had not announced it as an anniversary gift. I had not announced it as anything in particular. I had simply said, "Come see what I have been building." She put her hand on the doorframe, the one I had built out of reclaimed white oak, sanded down to a finish that was smooth without being slick, and she stood there with her hand on the wood like she was checking whether it was real. Gracie went straight in, 7 years old. No ceremony. Just motion. She ran through every room and came back to report that the bedroom with the window seat was hers and she was not negotiating. I stood in the yard. I always do that with a finished structure. Step back and look at it from the outside. Let the whole thing be itself for a minute without me in it. 40 years of habit. I thought about June. About the way she had once described the beach house she always wanted in that offhand way people talk about things they do not expect to actually happen. Nothing fancy, she had said. Just enough windows to feel like you are outside when you are in. This house had 7 windows on the ocean side. I had counted them more than once during construction and thought about that. Standing in the yard while my daughter walked through the rooms and my granddaughter claimed her window seat, I told myself something simple. I think she would have liked the view. I think she would have liked knowing Nora had somewhere safe. That night I drove home to Calverton. The house was quiet, the same as it always was, but it felt different. Not emptier exactly. More like a chapter had ended on the right word. For 6 months, the house was exactly what I built it to be. Then September came. Spring turned to summer at Harlow Beach the way it always does. Quietly, with salt in the air, and the sound of Gracie's feet on the porch boards every Saturday morning when I pulled into the driveway. She had a habit of hearing my truck before it even turned onto the street. I never figured out how. By the time I cut the engine, she was already at the edge of the front walkway in whatever she had slept in. Sometimes a dinosaur shirt, sometimes a dress she had clearly put on herself because the buttons were wrong. She would stand there with both arms raised like I had been gone for a year instead of 5 days. I was never a man who cried easily, but those mornings came close. We had a routine, the 3 of us. Nora would be inside starting breakfast by the time I came through the door, and the house would smell like coffee and the faint sweetness of whatever fruit she had cut up for Gracie. I would set my jacket on the brass hook by the door, the one I had installed myself at the right height for a child and an adult both. Then we would eat at the kitchen table with the windows open and the ocean doing what the ocean does, sitting there indifferent to everything, which somehow made it easy to talk. Nora looked better that spring than she had in years. There was color in her face. She walked without favoring her left knee the way she used to, because there were no stairs to negotiate, no uneven thresholds to catch her off guard. I noticed it the second week of April, watching her cross the kitchen in bare feet, and I felt something I did not have a word for at the time. It was not pride exactly. It was more like relief, the feeling of a calculation finally coming out right. Brett was mostly absent in those months. On the occasions I asked, Nora said he was working. I did not press. A man has a right to his work, and I was not there to audit anyone's schedule. He appeared twice, maybe 3 times over the summer. Late Friday evenings, tired looking, gone again by Sunday afternoon. He was polite. He made coffee once and left the pot on for me without being asked. I thanked him and thought nothing more of it. One afternoon in June, Gracie and I were sitting on the back steps watching the tide come in. She was drawing in a small notebook she carried everywhere that summer, seashells mostly, and the occasional figure that was either a person or a very large crab depending on the angle. She stopped drawing, looked up at me, and said without any let-up at all, "Grandpa, why don't you live here with us?" I looked at her for a moment. "Because this is your house, sweetheart," I said. "My house is the one with the yellow door." She considered that with the gravity only an 8-year-old can bring to a simple fact. Then she nodded once and went back to her drawing. I do not think she fully understood the distinction I was making, and truthfully, I am not sure I could have explained it any better if she had asked me to try. My house was 25 minutes north in Calverton, 2 bedrooms, a carport, a side yard I kept tidy more out of habit than preference. I had lived there since June died. It was not a lonely house exactly, but it was a quiet one, the kind of quiet that accumulates slowly over years until you stop noticing it and start mistaking it for peace. Coming to Harlow Beach on Saturdays was the opposite of that quiet. Audrey Dalton lived 3 houses down on the same stretch of road. A compact woman in her mid-60s with short gray hair and the precise, unhurried way of speaking I had come to associate with people who had spent decades being listened to in rooms where it mattered. We had become properly acquainted during construction when she brought me coffee and asked, without being intrusive, what I was building and for whom. By that summer, we had settled into a Saturday morning habit. She would appear on her porch around 8 with 2 mugs, and I would walk over, and we would sit in the 2 old Adirondack chairs she kept facing the water and talk for an hour, sometimes less, occasionally more. She told me about cases she remembered, not the violent ones, the financial ones, the quiet frauds, the documents that looked right until someone looked twice. I told her about structures I had built. A pedestrian bridge in Oregon that outlasted its projected lifespan by 18 years. A school in rural Virginia where I had spent 6 weeks in the rain trying to get the drainage right. When you were 2 people not alone long enough to appreciate conversation that did not require anything of you afterward. On a Saturday toward the end of August, we were sitting in our usual chairs. The morning had gone flat and gray the way it does before the weather shifts, and the ocean was the color of old pewter. Audrey had her mug in both hands, which she did when she was thinking about something she had not yet decided to say. After a while, she set the mug down on the arm of the chair and looked across toward Nora's house. "Warren," she said, "how well do you actually know your son-in-law?" I thought about Brett. The polite appearances, the early departures, the coffee he had left warming on the counter. "Well enough," I said. Audrey nodded once. She did not say anything else, but she did not look away from the house either. I did not think much about what she said that afternoon. I had no reason to. Not yet. The first Saturday of September, I pulled into the driveway and saw a familiar car parked in front of the house, and a full-size suitcase standing just inside the open front door. I sat in my truck for a moment before getting out. The car was Brett's, a silver sedan I had seen in various driveways and parking lots over 12 years. Recently acquired, still carrying the small circular sticker from the dealership on the rear window. The suitcase was dark navy, upright, the kind with 4 spinner wheels and an extendable handle locked at full height. Not a weekend bag. Not even a week bag. The kind of luggage a person packs when he is not certain how long he will be gone. The front door was standing open in the way doors stand open when someone has just come through and left it that way because he expected to pass through again or because he had stopped thinking about it. The morning air was still warm. September at Harlow Beach holds its warmth longer than inland, and through the open door I could hear the particular sounds of a kitchen in use, the coffee maker cycling, a cabinet opening and closing, the low murmur of a radio on a station I did not recognize. I got out and went inside. Brett was at the kitchen table. He was wearing a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. His weekend presentation, the version of himself he wore when he was being comfortable on purpose, He had a coffee mug in front of him and his phone face down beside it. He looked up when I came through the door with the easy, unhurried smile I had known since 2012 and had never quite been able to assess accurately. "Warren," he said. "Good timing. Coffee's fresh." Nora was at the counter slicing a melon, her back partly to me. She turned when she heard my voice, came over, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "Sit down," in the automatic way she had said it every Saturday since the house was finished. The kitchen smelled like coffee and cut fruit and that particular salt-warm combination that came through the screen door from the beach side of the house. Everything about it looked the same as every other Saturday morning I had walked into since March, except for the suitcase in the entryway standing at full height with its handle extended, going nowhere. I sat down. Nora put a plate in front of me. Brett refreshed his own coffee and then, without being asked, poured a second mug and set it at my place before returning to his chair. It was a small thing, the kind of thing a person does when he knows where the mugs are kept and which cabinet holds the filters and how many scoops the machine takes. The kind of thing a person learns over time, or over the last day and a half. "I didn't know you were coming out this weekend," I said. It was not a question, but it contained one. Brett leaned back in his chair with the relaxed posture of a man making himself comfortable in a space he had decided was comfortable. "I needed to get out of the city for a bit," he said. "The market's been difficult. Things are recalibrating, which means everyone's waiting and nothing's moving. And you can only sit in a downtown office watching nothing move for so long before it starts to wear on you. Nora suggested I come out and clear my head. Better to work from here than stare at the walls down there." Nora smiled from the counter. She looked comfortable. Not the brittle kind of comfortable that means something is being held together. The genuine kind. The kind that comes from having the pieces of an ordinary morning in the right places. Brett in the kitchen. Coffee made. Her father at the table. I drank the coffee Brett had poured and thought nothing particular about it. There was no reason, at that point, to think anything particular at all. Gracie came downstairs in the green sneakers she had worn continuously since June, the left one with its lace replaced by a piece of twine she had found on the beach, and refused to trade for an actual lace on the grounds that it worked fine. She sat beside me and ate the melon slices off my plate without asking, which was standard, and told me at length about a school project involving ocean ecosystems, which she had strong opinions about. Brett asked her one question, what her favorite ocean animal was. Gracie answered without hesitation that it was the mantis shrimp because it could punch things. Brett laughed. Gracie looked satisfied with this response. The conversation moved on. It was a normal morning. I remember thinking that very clearly in those exact words. This is a normal morning, as if I needed to say it to myself in order to confirm it. After lunch, Nora took Gracie down to the water. Brett and I ended up on the front porch. Not by arrangement, just by the way Saturday afternoons sometimes arrange themselves when the women in the house go somewhere and two men are left with the space between them and nothing specific to fill it. Brett was looking at the house rather than the water. He had done this before during the walkthrough in March, and once or twice since. That particular quality of attention he brought to the structure, the lot, the sightlines from the porch to the beach. I had filed it away without labeling it. "Warren," he said, in the tone of a man making conversation. "What do you think this place goes for now? With the lot, the view, the build quality, all of it?" I looked at him. "It's not for sale," I said. He raised one hand slightly, a gesture of concession. "Of course not. I'm not suggesting anything. It's a professional habit. You're in a space like this and you start running numbers automatically." He glanced out at the water, then back at the house. "Properties on this stretch have been moving well, even with rates where they are. I'm just curious what the market would say." "Then you already know better than I do what the market would say," I told him. He smiled again, the easy one, and let the subject drop. We watched the water for a few minutes in the kind of silence that had always been available to us when we were not talking about anything that mattered. Then he went inside to take a call. I stayed on the porch. The afternoon light was coming in low across the dunes, and the beach grass was moving in the offshore wind, and the water was that green-blue color it gets in early September before the season shifts. I stood there and looked at the house I had built from the outside, the porch boards I had selected, the trim I had painted myself over a weekend in February. And I thought about what it meant that a man had just asked me what it was worth and called it curiosity. When I went back in to say goodbye, Gracie followed me out to the truck. She walked beside me down the front path without saying anything, which was unusual because Gracie generally had something to say in transit. At the truck door, she stopped and looked up at me with the expression she wore when she was carrying something she had been holding for a while. She reached out and took hold of my jacket sleeve lightly. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "Dad's been on his phone a lot, like really late. After I'm supposed to be asleep, I can hear him talking." I looked at her for a moment. She was watching me with the clear, uncomplicated attention of a child who has reported a fact and is waiting to see whether it is the kind of fact that matters. "Okay, sweetheart," I said. "Thank you for telling me." She nodded, let go of my sleeve, and went back up the path. I drove home. The 25 minutes north on Route 17 had always felt like a reasonable distance. Close enough for weekends, far enough for a life. That evening, sitting at my kitchen table in Calverton with the lights on and the house quiet around me, it felt like something else. Not far, but not close enough. Brett had called it curiosity. But in my experience, men who ask about price rarely stop at asking. After that Saturday, I started coming by more often. Not just on weekends. I told myself it was because I missed Gracie. That was part of it. The other part I did not yet have a name for. The Wednesday morning was ordinary in the way September mornings at Harlow Beach tend to be, cooler than August. The light flatter, the tourist traffic gone. I had no particular reason to drive out that day. I had a materials review I could have finished at home. And my coffee was already made. And the 25 minutes each way was not nothing. But I locked up the house anyway, backed out of the carport, and pointed the truck south toward the coast. I turned onto Harlow Road at 8:53. I know the time because I checked the dashboard clock when I made the turn. A habit from 40 years of job sites where everything that mattered eventually came down to when. The man was standing on the sidewalk in front of Nora's house. He was wearing a light blue polo shirt and carrying a clipboard under one arm. His phone was raised, and he was photographing the house methodically, the way a professional photographs something when he is building a record rather than taking a picture for himself. Front elevation, left side. Then he stepped back to capture the roofline. He moved without hurry, without looking around, the way a man moves when he is confident he has every right to be where he is. I pulled to the end of the driveway and stopped. I did not turn off the engine. In North Carolina, taking photographs of a building from a public sidewalk is not illegal. It is not even unusual. Appraisers do it. Insurance adjusters do it. Surveyors do it. There was nothing I could have pointed to in that moment and called a violation, but I had spent 4 decades reading structures, reading sites, reading the small details that told you whether something was sound or whether it was about to go wrong. And something about the way that man moved told me he was not there for any routine purpose. I reached for the door handle. He was faster. He folded the clipboard under his arm, walked briskly back toward a gray sedan parked 2 houses down, and was inside and pulling away before I had the door fully open. Not running, not looking back, just done. The way a man is done when he has finished what he came to do. I watched the car until it disappeared around the bend at the far end of the road. By the time I could have followed, there was nothing left to follow. I sat for a moment with the door open, and the engine still running. Then I pulled forward, parked properly, and went inside. Brett was in the living room when I came through the front door. I know that because I looked. Not obviously. Not the way you look when you are checking on something, but with the side glance a person learns after years of walking through places where you need to know where everyone is before you speak. He was standing near the window that faced the front yard. His phone was in his hand, screen up. He did not look out at me as I came up the walk. He may not have seen the man on the sidewalk. He may have seen him and thought nothing of it. He may have seen him and already known exactly who he was. I did not know which. I still do not know from that specific moment. "Warren," he said when I came in, "didn't know you were coming by. I was in the area," I told him. That was not true. But it was the kind of small untruth people use when they do not want to explain the actual reason, and Brett accepted it the way people accept those things when they do not want to look too closely. Gracie came downstairs in her green sneakers and launched herself at me with the standard level of force for a child who has been awake for 2 hours and has been waiting for something to happen. I caught her, and we sat at the kitchen table, and Brett made coffee, which I drank. And we talked about Gracie's second week of third grade and whether the new teacher was strict or just quiet, which Gracie had not yet determined. It was a normal visit. I made sure it felt like one. I sat there and drank that coffee and said nothing. Because I had nothing in hand, just a man with a camera, a clipboard, and a feeling I could not shake. Before I left, Gracie pressed a folded piece of paper into my jacket pocket. I opened it later at my truck. It was a crayon drawing. 3 figures standing at the water's edge, one tall, one medium, one small. Above the water in the upper left corner, she had drawn a round yellow shape with rays coming off it that I first took for the sun. Then I looked more closely and saw the word she had printed underneath in unsteady letters. June. I stood by my truck for a moment and looked at it. Then I got in, buckled up, and looked back toward the window where Brett had been standing. It was empty now. That night, back at my own house, I sat at my desk and thought about what I actually knew about Brett and what I did not. The desk was the same one I had used for 30 years, solid oak, shallow center drawer, 2 deeper ones on the right side. The kind of desk that accumulates the record of a working life without trying. Project binders, inspection logs, correspondence, going back to the 1990s. I kept it orderly out of habit. In 40 years of structural engineering, the difference between a detail you wrote down and a detail you thought you remembered could be the difference between a building that stood and one that did not. So I pulled out a fresh legal pad and wrote the date at the top. The first thing I wrote was not about the man with the clipboard, it was about the loan. $25,000 transferred to Brett's account in March of 2019. I had the bank record in a folder in the bottom drawer because I keep bank records the way I keep everything else. Organized, labeled, retrievable. I found it in under 2 minutes. The original transfer confirmation was there. Every quarterly statement since then was there. What was not there was any record of repayment. Not a single deposit. Not a partial payment. Not a note. Not a text. Not even a conversation I could recall in which Brett had acknowledged the debt after the first year. I had stopped expecting it somewhere around 2021 and had quietly reclassified it in my own accounting as a loss. The kind of thing you absorb for the sake of family and do not mention at holidays. I had told myself that was generosity. Looking at the empty space where repayment should have been, I began to think it was something closer to carelessness. I wrote it down. $25,000. March 2019. No contract. No repayment. 5 years. Then I called Audrey. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she was still awake and had probably been expecting the call. That was the thing about Audrey. She did not say much that was unnecessary. But she was rarely surprised. I described the man. Light blue polo, clipboard. Photographing the house from the sidewalk. Methodical. Done and gone before I could get out of my truck. There was a brief silence on her end. I saw him too, she said. Tuesday of last week. I was coming back from my walk and he was parked in front of the house. He had a clipboard then as well. Tuesday of last week. The week before my Wednesday visit. He was there twice, I said. At least twice that I saw, Audrey replied. I wrote down the plate number. She read it to me. I wrote it on the legal pad, pressing hard enough that the numbers indented the sheet beneath. Virginia plate, she said. Dark gray sedan. She thought it was a Honda or something similar. I thanked her. She asked whether I was going to look into it. I said I was thinking about it. Warren, she said. And the way she said my name had that measured quality I had come to associate with her years on the bench. The tone of someone who had learned that the right question at the right moment is more useful than an answer. When a man photographs a property from a public sidewalk, he is usually being paid to do it by someone who has an interest in the property. I already knew that. But hearing it said plainly by someone who had spent 2 decades listening to people explain why they had done things made it sit differently than it had in